Recognized from the Great Lakes to Quebec is covered with the dish with one spoon wampum between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share this territory and protect the land. We all eat out of the dish, all of us that share this territory with only one spoon. Finally, I want to recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of Turtle Island.
You may all be seated. Now I'll pass it on to Evan.
Thank you, Isaiah. Hello, everyone. My name is Evan Wu. I am a student trustee this year for the Toronto District School Board, and I'm also a grade 12 student at Earl Haig Secondary School. It is an honor to be one of our moderators today for this wonderful panel. We're all in for a treat. I recall actually being part of the festivities for Asian Heritage Month back in grade 1 in 2010 and 2011. So this is like a full circle, and I'm happy to end my time at the board here celebrating Asian heritage. Thank you, and I'll pass it over to Isaiah.
Thanks, Evan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isaiah Shafka. I'm Two-Spirit, Mi'kmaq, and Lean Clan, and I'm the Indigenous Student Trustee for the Toronto District School Board. I'm also a grade 11 student at Kapap-Machpe Wandering Spirit School. Now on to our moderators. Our panelists. Our first panelist for today is Danielle Besnar. She is a partner with Calavuzo LLP, practicing in areas of workers and Indigenous rights, equality, health, and Aboriginal law. She's also the chair of the firm's student committee. She represents unions and associations, regulated professionals, including nurses and midwives, and First Nations in diverse contexts, including labor disputes, government relations, human rights, constitutional law, health equity, pay equity, professional regulation, judicial review, and appeals, and she has particular expertise in the healthcare, policing, and public sector.
Now on to our second
panelist, Evan.
We have one of our own, Emily Chan. She's a TDSB teacher, and she is also the president of the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice. The organization educates, engages, and advocates for social justice and equity for all in Canada. Collaborating with partner organizations, her council led the social media campaign to stop the spread of racism, launched the #FaceRace campaign, developed anti-racism education tools for children and parents, and coordinated advocacy efforts, calling for government actions to address racism and its impact. Amy Go is also a social worker by training and has dedicated her professional career to serving immigrants and seniors, promoting and advocating for culturally and linguistically appropriate care and health equity for racialized communities.
Next, we have another one
of our own, Salima Kam. She is currently the centrally assigned principal for equity, anti-oppression, and anti-racism with our board. Salima's career has been quite impressive. Salima started out as an educator in the Vancouver School Board and later moved to Toronto, where she became an educator with the TDSB. She then moved into a central teacher role with the TDSB, focused on collaboratively inquiring in numeracy, literacy, and equity. In 2013, Salima became a course director with the Faculty of Education at York U, where she worked in the Fine Arts and Social Justice site and the concurrent program, co-developing the first Teaching for Diverse and Equitable Schools course for teacher candidates. She also ran the York Center for Education and Community Summer Institute for 3 years with Dr. Carl James.
Before returning
to the TDSB as a vice principal, she had over 20 years of experience in education and is here with us today to provide her views and insights onto today's topics of discussion.
Thank you, Isaiah. This is Amy Go. I apologize, we got the order wrong, but Amy, yeah, this is Amy, and I just read her bio, and so I'd like to go back to Emily Chan, and I'll read her bio as well. My apologies. So Emily is one of her own as well. And Emily is a longtime community educator who has worked in the environmental justice and workers' rights movements in Toronto and New York City. She has 15 years as a TDSB elementary educator. Emily is one of 8 co-authors of the Addressing Anti-Asian Racism Resource for Educators, produced by the TDSB and the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. She also recently co-wrote 3 Indigenous education curriculum resources for Ontario educators. She began doing anti-oppression work in high school when she taught Chinese Canadian history for younger grades to fill the gaps in the curriculum. She loves being an educator and sharing her passion for social justice, collaboration, and the transformative power of student voice. Again, my apologies, but now we have Emily and Amy established, and I'm so excited to get into our panel today.
Thanks, Evan. Now,
Before we go on to the questions, we're going to define the terms settler colonialism and white privilege. So first, I'll start off with settler colonialism. This is a super short and sweet definition that hopefully we all can understand. Settler colonialism is a structure that perpetuates the elimination of Indigenous people and cultures to replace them with settler society. Now I'm going to define white privilege. So a quote from Ibram X. Kendi sums up white privilege perfectly. White privileges are the relative advantages racism affords to people who identify as white, whether white people recognize them or deny them. To be white is to be afforded one's individuality, afforded the presumption of innocence, afforded the assumption of intelligence, afforded empathy when crying or raging, afforded disproportionate amounts of policy-making power, afforded opportunity from a white network, afforded wealth-building homes and resource-rich schools, afforded the ability to vote quickly and easily.
now to our first
First question.
Thank you, Isaiah. Our first panel question is that Asian Canadians are stereotyped and being silenced as being silenced minority groups. So what are the actions that we can take to break these stereotypes? Over the past few years, actually, we've seen on the news being stereotyped for Asian Canadian groups, and as well, we've seen real cultural impacts and changes that have happened and occurred because of the silencing and because of the stereotyping. And so I'm really interested to hear from any of our panelists, anyone who wants to speak on perhaps the ways and the actions that we can take to mitigate these effects in our society today. So is there anyone who would like to share a piece?
I'll go first.
Sure,
Oh,
Amy.
sorry, Salima, go first. Sorry, no, never.
Please go ahead, Amy. I'll go after you.
So I guess, it is important to see the context of the sort of like the silenced minority stereotype and why it's there in the first place, right? The silenced or the model minority, whatever term we use, it actually came from the States, a civil rights movement, and it's used against the, basically it's to divide and conquer. Right, the African Americans are trying to assert their rights, rightfully so, and then so the white, as we said, people, the white privileged class say, well, look at the Asians, look at the Japanese, look at the Chinese. They are not fighting for these rights. They are just keeping their head low and going about their thing. They're not challenging the system. They're not challenging us. And so this modern minority came from there. And so we need to look at the context and look at why it's there. And so if we want to challenge this model minority or silenced minority myth and stereotype, we really need to look at why it's there in the first place and to break down those and have that analysis. Right, the white supremacy, the impact of colonization, the exploitation of minority groups, of Asians being included in that. And so actions that we can take, of course, it's anti-racism, anti-discrimination, anti-oppression, in the education sector to speak about that. Right, and to dissect and analyze how the education sector has perpetuated that stereotype inadvertently, subconsciously, and how does it impact on the student population, not just Asian students, but all students. So, I think it is important to frame it, to understand it context and why is there, and who are benefiting from that. And so that's my approach to this. And thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I want to follow up on your point. I see that you've actually developed, I think it's education tools for students and adults. And so what exactly do you address in that when you're tackling sort of a topic like this?
I know. So thanks to Jacqueline Wong and Sarah Leung, two educators who help us develop those tremendous resources. In fact, before we do that, we actually hosted focus group discussions in Toronto and Vancouver with parents and children themselves to hear from them. And what we found out was that parents and children don't talk about racism, even though they have been subjected to racism from, and bullying in school or in the workplace, and nobody talked about that, right? So it really, in a way, it's like, oh, these small numbers, they kept their suffering and their pain in silence. So the resources that we developed was to break that, right? Was to help them understand that. And we specifically highlighted the anti-Indigenous, and colonization impact. Specifically, we highlighted anti-Black racism because we wanted to the students to understand that systemic piece, the colonization and all that on us as Asians, as well as, of course, other communities. And we actually have a very privileged to have Indigenous educators who help review those context, those materials.
Thank you. Yes, I love the idea of really breaking the stigma and really talking about things that are often taboo in households, not just Asian households, any households, on racism, equity, oppression. And I love that you're taking action to make that resource available so that we talk about it, we actually bring it up and learn about the ways that we can discuss and really mitigate those effects in our society, in our homes, our communities, and schools. So thank you. Wonderful. I saw that Salima also wanted to speak to this question.
Thank you, Evan. For those people that know me, I often answer questions with more questions. So I'm actually going to invite all the students and educators that are on the call right now to think about what it means to be Asian and who gets to decide what Asian is, or who Asian is, or who is Asian enough. Because I think I'd like to invite us to flip the script on actually starting with affirmation as opposed to starting with oppression, and thinking about all the multiplicities that make up who we are, whether we identify as Asian or we don't, and what that means with intersections. So for example, I identify as female, I identify as brown, I sometimes identify as Asian, I identify as straight, I am the component of all of those things and so many more. So when we're talking about being silenced or stereotyped, what does it mean to be all of the fragments of ourselves as whole beings? And so as young people in schools and classrooms, are there spaces for you to be yourselves in your full, complicated, authentic selves? That doesn't stop, by the way, even when you become an adult. And as educators, how are we creating conditions or co-creating conditions with students to carve out spaces so that students can be who they want to be, which is more than silenced, more than being seen as a minority, more than just being pigeonholed into one identity. And so I invite us to think about these questions as we think about who we are in our identity formations, because we're always becoming. We're never just one thing at one time. So I offer that to start off the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Salima. And I see a Q&A where someone actually brought up that they believe that Asian means your family comes from Asia. It's determined by geography. And although that is true, I love your perspective on intersectionality in the sense that, yes, I may be Asian, but on top of that, there's so many other aspects and we're multifaceted. And I know Kimberly Crenshaw coined that term, but we're multifaceted in the sense that there's so many different bits and pieces. Like I come from a middle income family. I live in Toronto. I'm a male. I'm Asian, of course. I love playing the guitar. There's so many different pieces of our identity that make up who we are. And so as much as we like to put things into a term or a bracket, we're really unique and different in our own ways. And being able to embrace that, I think that's something that we should really focus on and look into. So thank you for sharing that perspectives as well, Salima. And our second question here, it's a little more recent, and it's during COVID-19. I'm sure that we've all seen on the news or in the media about Asian Canadians facing heightened racism because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And especially those who are from the East and Southeast Asian communities, we've seen a direct impact and influence on our culture and race. And so I'm interested to hear from maybe those who haven't spoken yet, but how has this directly affected or impacted you and your community? And what actions have you taken or would you want to take or encourage others to take to address this anti-Asian hate and racism? So I know Danielle hasn't spoken yet, or Emily hasn't spoken as well. If either of them, Emily.
I can speak by sharing a story from a fellow educator who recently experienced, as a teacher in virtual school, she was leading a class and then there were some racial slurs written in the chat. And she wasn't aware of the situation when it was happening because she was in the middle of teaching a class and setting up breakout rooms. And so it was some students who pointed out to her that this had happened. And in fact, because of her own experience in life, she also happens to be Asian Canadian. She hadn't experienced, she hadn't heard of these racial slurs before. And so she did some research. She listened to her students, and when she tried to address the situation directly, the student had left the virtual meet, and it was very difficult to try to address the situation. But I would say that sort of post-COVID or in our life and living in a pandemic, those racial slurs happened, and as a part of a rise in anti-Asian hate and this allowance for anti-Asian hate to occur. And, after spending a lot of time and energy talking with their students and their families, and steps were taken to address and restore the relationships in the class. But, I would just say that this is a direct impact of the rise of anti-Asian hate out in the community and in our schools. It's happening in classrooms. And I just want to follow on Salima's invitation to just ask students today to think about a time when something happened at school that you might have been very uncomfortable with, and how did it make you feel, and what would help to sort of support you to take the next step in raising and standing up to these acts of hate. I know in the situation that I just explained, it took for this, my fellow educator, to reach out to other educators and ask for support. And so we do that as adults. We ask each other for support and we lean on each other for support. So I'd just like to add to the questions to our audience. Who do you lean on for support? Who do you have to reach out to help you when you're experiencing racism difficult situations in school and outside of school.
Thank you for sharing, Emily. Definitely, we've seen it in our schools, our communities, and it's perpetrating around, and definitely this is why we're having this webinar. This is why we're talking about it, and sharing our stories and what happened so that we can connect with others. And I'm sure students are discussing in their classrooms or will after this webinar on experiences that they've had as well. And perhaps by sharing, we can actually find solutions or see, oh, maybe this worked for someone. That's a great way to approach this conversation. And that's a great way to think of it. And I really appreciate you for sharing and giving that perspective as well. Thank you. Amy has her hand up. Yes.
So just very quickly following up with Emily, and I know, oh, sorry, actually I should let Danielle because she hasn't had a chance. Just very quickly, actually in our partner organization, CCNC Toronto chapter has done as a portal that invited people who have experienced hate to report or witnessed hate. And many of these actually were targeting Asian and East Asian and Southeast Asian. And actually there were quite a few reports came from people younger than 18 and many younger children, because in the school they were called Corona Girl. They were called, you know, a Vietnamese Canadian kid was blamed for bringing this mess to Canada. And many of the perpetrators actually were principals and teachers. So the example that Emily given was a student, and you know, and even so difficult for an educator to address to confront this issue, and the power dynamic, right? Because educator definitely has more power than the students, and the students was emboldened to even challenge the educator. So you can imagine an Asian student having that kind of racist experience from people in the position of power in the school setting. So again, I think this is something that I would turn to people in the position of power, right? In the leadership in TSBSB. What are you doing as leaders to address this? What systems are you setting up to support students, to support educators, be it Asians and others who are facing discriminatory actions, bullying, racism, and all that. So it is a question, again, in particular, I think people in the position of power needs to reflect and need to specifically take action.
Thank you, Amy. And definitely that power play and power dynamic is so essential. And as leaders, people who are held to higher standard, we need to examine the ways, especially myself, and I know Isaiah, and the TDSB as well. How can we better support communities and remove systemic barriers to anti-hate and making sure that everyone has access and the ability to fully represent themselves. And Danielle, I'm going to let you speak. I know you want to answer this as well.
Thanks, Evan. And thanks to all the other speakers for their insights. I wanted to draw together a few threads from the answer to the last question and this one, because I think one thing that has shifted to some degree in terms of getting more public attention in the context of the pandemic is that I think many of us have grown up and in various points in our lives experienced racism of different kinds on a spectrum of exclusion in terms of not being included or invited into mainstream activities or just not feeling welcome in certain spaces. But what has really shifted, I think, during the pandemic is how much more explicit and common racist incidents and incidents of really clear and much more aggressive and public racism have become to the degree of hate. And when I think about how to disrupt this kind of racism, I think about a few things. One is sort of on an internal and community level, how do we develop the strength and power to be able to name and feel that we're entitled to not be treated this way. And one of the things that I think it was Amy said in her comments earlier was that parents and children don't talk about racism. And I totally agree. And I think that as a parent, shout out to Rawlinson Community School. I'm a parent of 2 primary age kids that are too young to be watching today, but I think it is so important for parents to be talking to their children, not just about racism, but the other thing that parents and children so often don't talk about in immigrant communities is migration. What happened? How did we get here? Why did we leave home? What did we lose when we left home? And there's such a narrative that we're framed into and is part of this model minority myth about, well, we've come to the land of opportunity. We should be grateful to be here. Anyone can succeed here if they work hard enough, if they're exceptional enough, if they're good enough, if they're cooperative enough. And that can really, that kind of attitude perpetuates a lot of harms. But I think one of the counters to that is talking about migration, talking about what we left behind, talking about, was there a dictatorship that we left behind? How did we come to Canada? What were the constraints on our citizenship when we came to Canada? Did we come to Canada as independent immigrants? Did we come to Canada as domestic workers? Were we allowed to choose where we lived? Were we allowed to bring our families with us? And if not, why not? And just connecting this to the other theme of the panel in terms of Indigenous allyship, I think that's one of the ways that Asian immigrant communities and immigrant communities more broadly can really not only develop their own understanding of their own history, which can give strength on an individual and community level to resist racism, but also to have an analysis of the colonial practices of the state and how our own histories as immigrants, as non-desirable brown, Black immigrants that were specifically excluded by Canadian immigration policy until the 1960s and 1970s, how that's deeply connected to the separation of Indigenous children from their communities so that Canada could exploit land and resources. So, I think that this question of understanding one's own family migration story and how that family migration story fits into the broader migration history of your cultural community is an important foundation for being able to develop the skills and confidence and community supports to be able to resist racism when it becomes so explicit as it is in the current times.
Thank you, Danielle. And I know that you work as a lawyer and you represent numerous groups, marginalized communities. And I just want to quickly ask you, do you still see in our law today or the policies and procedures, do you still see those effects now and still actually affecting communities or racism and if it's still targeted in the ways that we have definitely changed from the 70s, but still maybe have right now in our law?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Absolutely. I mean, I start the way that I practice law is from the premise that all law in Canada favors the powerful, and historically that has been, white property holding, usually male Canadians. And, there have been a lot of developments in the law in the last few decades that provides legal tools to be able to challenge that status quo. But, generally as a system, the law does still continue to favor the powerful. And when people are able to challenge the law, they still have to have the resources to be able to hire lawyers and, do research and all those kinds of things that are needed to support things like court challenges. So, I think that there are tools that exist, and part of what I bring in terms of my own personal understanding of that family and community history of migration and how that fits into the broader Canadian story is trying to bring those tools and to serve communities that are working to disrupt those power structures. So yeah, I mean, always be suspicious of the law.
And definitely that colonial structure and our history, it's something that we've built a foundation on, and definitely examining it and seeing how we can modernize and change it. It's a slow process, but it's definitely something that needs to be done. Thank you. And in the interest of time, we will move on to the next panel question. We still have 3 more, and so I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunities. To Sharon, Isaiah, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Evan. So
For question 3, it states the model minority myth is a narrative that negatively situates Asian Canadian communities' relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and other communities. So the model minority myth, before we continue, is a minority group whose members are perceived as having achieved success through hard work and determination, who are perceived as being suitable models for other minorities to emulate. So understanding that, how do we challenge, break, and actively dispel the model minority myth?
I'll pass
That on to our panelists if someone wants to raise their hand.
Salima.
Thank you, Isaiah. It's funny because I feel like part of my life's work has been always, what is it? You know, I always disrupted the model minority myth. So if you want to work with stereotypes, I was not good at math growing up. I hated science. I actually wanted to be an actor or a DJ or a backup dancer for Janet Jackson. I might be aging myself here, but I'm laughing because I wonder about how we within our homes and our families and our communities continue to perpetuate that model minority myth, because when we are seen as model minorities, we actually are benefiting. And it means that we have power because we're closer to a construct of whiteness, which systemically means that there is access to more power. And I also think about how we might engage in harm against other communities who are not seen as palatable immigrants. So I think there's a lot of conversation that is important to have with ourselves as individuals, with our families. Danielle, you spoke about knowing our histories and knowing where we came from and why we're here and why we might have had to be a certain way. Maybe we didn't have a choice because in order to survive in a space that we didn't want to come to willingly, maybe we had to be a particular way. So I think it's important that we recognize that we all have agency and we all have power. So how do we use that to consider and disrupt the model minority myth? I think it's also important to think about in education, in classrooms, how are we having these conversations through teaching and learning? So how are we providing representation in all areas of teaching and learning with folks from various communities? How are we ensuring that there are a multiplicity of voices in the literature that we read? How are we inviting families and caregivers into classroom spaces to share stories? Because that's all teaching and learning, that's all curriculum. Those are all resources. And then again, an invitation to students. How are you writing your own stories? How are you speaking about your own stories? Because the idea that hard work and determination, or what my father told me was, he used the word meritocracy. If you work hard, then you're going to get to where you want to go. But some of us don't always get to be where we want to be because there's a ceiling and we're put into a box. So I think it's important we use our own voices to be able to challenge these stereotypes with each other. I think it's important that we find collective care with each other to find like-minded individuals who want to do this work. And I also just wanted to address, because it's connected, a question that came in the Q&A, which is how do we address hate? The model minority myth is a form of hate and oppression as well. And that's where we can educate each other, or we can call each other in or call each other out, or we can ask for clarification and say, is this what you mean when you said this? So I also wanted to make sure that I put some concrete strategies in the space as well. Thanks, Isaiah, for the question.
Thank you, Salima.
It's definitely, important and critical that we center the way we teach around community and community-based learning rather than the colonial construct of only the teacher holds knowledge in the classroom, because that's not true. There are 30 minds in the classroom, 30 people who live different lives, and each of those come with lived experiences and teachings that should be and are valued and have value. Next, so we're going to continue with this question. If someone else would like to answer, you can unmute or put up your hand.
Or I can call on
You.
Danielle.
I think that one of the ways, and I sort of want to focus on the first part of this question that talks about how the model minority myth is a narrative that negatively situates Asian Canadian communities with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. I'm a second generation settler of Philippine ancestry. I grew up in unceded Coast Salish and Musqueam territory, also known as Vancouver. I went to school with predominantly white classmates. I didn't know any Indigenous kids growing up. I knew very little about Canada's settler colonial history. I knew very little, as I mentioned earlier, about sort of my own family migration history. I knew very little about Canadian immigration policies, Indian residential schools, all of these things that were either huge silences in any learning growing up, or had negative affiliations, either in terms of we don't talk about that, or we're model minorities, and if we behave a certain way, we will get access to privileges and opportunities that aren't available to others who don't behave a certain way. And that kind of divisive function of the model minority stereotype is harmful, both in terms of instilling a sense of pressure for perfection in the children that it's applied to, but also a sense of a separateness and superiority, which I think are can be very damaging in terms of relating to others and understanding our role as settlers in this country. And in terms of what can be done to challenge and dispel that dynamic, I want to go back to the importance of really understanding our own personal and migration histories. Because when you think about some of the specificities of how Asian Canadians are in Canada, you have the history, which I'm sure others on this panel can speak to much more eloquently, of Chinese railway workers coming to Canada, not being allowed to bring family with them, being discouraged from settling through the head tax. Similarly, South Asian Indian immigrants not being allowed to bring family with them, male laborers coming. And similarly with the early Filipino migration, it was male laborers who came to work in the farm and fishery industries and on the West Coast without any access to bringing their families with them. I think really understanding those histories and how the state has structured inequality for various groups throughout its history is really important because one of the things that we have in common is the ways that that the law has operated to keep us apart, keep us separated from opportunities that have historically existed, and privilege that has existed more readily for white settler Canadians. And so I think really understanding those histories helps us to be better allies to other communities of color and to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and being allies with other communities of color and communities that have been oppressed by the laws and policies of the Canadian state throughout its history is the opposite of being a model minority, and I think is something that that justice and fairness I feel call me to do, and so that's one perspective on that question.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
Just looking at the time, we could talk about this all day long, and we should, but we have 15 minutes left, so we're going to move on to the next question. So the next question talks about why it is important for Asian Canadian communities to be in relationship with Indigenous peoples and communities. Now, you'll also see their Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, 43, 62, and 63. 62 and 63 are centered around education. I do highly recommend that everyone look at the calls to action. It's an extremely informative report. And also many Indigenous leaders state truth must come before reconciliation. So I'm going to pass it on to some of our panelists to talk to why it's important for Asian Canadian communities to be in relationship with Indigenous peoples and communities. First, I'll call on Amy.
So thank you very, very much. I think it's important for us to look at the context of the impact of colonization, right? And we have said that many times, right? In Canada, it is, we are still living in we are still living the impact of colonization and the white supremacy and white privileges. And because of that, what we emphasize, the model minorities are labor that would seen as of value to society, right? Of value means that, oh, you are making the society financial term, the economic prosperity. So everything that we as Canadians are defined by our value, but how much economic prosperity we're gonna bring to Canada, right? And that's why, you know, these Asian minorities is like, oh, wow, we'll be in county, we'll be, you know, whatever, so that our jobs can bring prosperity and economic stability, sustainability to Canada. And that's why we are not able to realize and really truly be our authentic self, be ourselves and utilize the skills and potentials that we have. And because of that, we have to recognize that colonization and the continuing impact of colonization on the Indigenous communities who are the first, you know, in this nation, in this country, and how they have been truly exploited and also eliminated in order to serve the white masters, in order to serve and continue that privilege. And so if we look at it this way, how can we not be in support of truth and reconciliation? How can we not be allies in solidarity to combat that? Because ultimately, we all have a responsibility to combat colonization, the continuing impact of colonialism, colonization, the continuing impact of white privileges. And we have to learn the truth, learn why the impact of the Indigenous community is so critical for our own survival. So I'm speaking as if it's from a self-interest perspective, but it's not. If we are to strive for collective good, if we are to strive for a Canada that is truly inclusive, we have to start there. We have to start from truth and reconciliation, understanding that impact and each and every single community and how we are connected to that story, how we continue to connect to that myth of this, of value, who is of value, who is going to continue that, what economic power that certain groups would continue to benefit from. So so from that, I think all of us have the responsibility to uphold and understand truth and reconciliation so that there is true equity, there's true prosperity for all of us in all sense of that word. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
I also know Salima would like to answer the question.
Thank you. And I wanted to have us consider 3 words: responsibility, listening, and counter narratives. So I'm going to start with responsibility. And I agree, Amy, it's each of our responsibilities as we live on Turtle Island. Again, whether we were brought here willingly or we were brought here through the Atlantic slave trade or through indentured labor or forced migration, we are here on Turtle Island. And so the 2 words are truth and reconciliation, and truth has to come before, as is stated here. So it's our responsibility to learn that truth, because we are settlers, even if the settler-colonizer relationship might be complicated because of the different journeys through which many of us have come. I want to come to listening, and that means listening to those who do identify as Indigenous, to First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples, recognizing that there are many, many, many voices in between. So in classrooms, who are the primary sources? Who are the primary voices? And are we listening to stories pre-residential schooling? Because again, as I started sharing in the panel, how do we start with affirmation and not oppression? What are the stories pre-contact, and how are we providing spaces for students and educators to engage in this very, very necessary work? Because even as all of us have come to Turtle Island, they are moments in time, right? So do we understand the full timeline? One of my learnings has been with System Superintendent Tanya Senk, the first Indigenous board lead at the TDSB. Isaiah, I see you smiling there. And she's been teaching me about the pedagogy of truth. And so I did some reading, Elizabeth Fast and Marie-Eve Drouin-Gagné, and the importance of acknowledging the violence that has happened and continues to impact so many of us. Thinking about cultural safety and what does that mean? So when we share our stories and our shared histories, what does that mean? How are we working in place-based solidarity? What is our relationship with the land? And as students and educators, how do we understand the information and knowledge and education that we have had? And how do we need to make sure that those gaps are filled in? And that is part of counter narratives, and making sure that we're giving space and voice to multiple folks. Thank you.
Danielle, Salima, and Amy, you've spoken so well, and we've covered so much content. And I just want to add, by drawing from you all, that in response to the 5th question, so we have the 5th question up there to the panelists, that we also look at how we notice, name, and interrupt the cycles of racism, the cycles of colonization, how we there it is, there's the question, how we need to acknowledge our roles within Canada's white settler colonial project, meaning that there are many stories to where we are right now. And so I just want to give an example of how we can disrupt white settler colonial privilege. As an educator, I just want to echo Danielle's points to starting with the self. As an educator, when I have done a timeline of history in Canada, I might choose, significant events, in a historical timeline, while inserting notable events within our personal history. So asking students to find out from their families, their migration stories, and to insert, in this year, the vote was given to Chinese and Indigenous peoples. Well, in this year, my family actually arrived in Canada, so that we're making connections between one's personal history and inserting that into, the bigger picture, and also making connections across our communities that way. The more we tell our stories, the more we find connections with other people in different communities, the more we find connections with Indigenous community members, the more we find connections with Black community members and other racialized community members. So starting with the self, knowing who our communities are, and then being able to make connections with each other, that is interrupting the cycles of racism, interrupting the cycle of a dominant narrative. And I just want to add one more point to say that this resource that we wrote, Addressing Anti-Asian Racism for Educators, this came out of a student sending an email to Karen Murray, principal of the equity department in the TDSB, and saying we need to do more. And so I just wanted to say to students that when you speak up and when you notice, name, and interrupt racism, big things can happen. And it might take a lot of time. It may take a lot of support. It may take a lot of voices, but we're at a moment now where many voices are being heard. And so it's a really powerful time to do something about that and to really address justice and truth and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Definitely wonderful points, everyone. And thank you for sharing your insight and your knowledge. I see that we have around 5 minutes left. And so I wanted to answer a few Q&A questions from the public. And one that I have from our viewers today is it okay to identify as Asian if you are not from stereotypical Asian countries like Korea, China, Japan, and you are from other countries like India, Pakistan, and other countries? So maybe we can have short, quick answers for these questions. Yes, Salima, for sure.
I think that's a great question. Asia is a massive, massive continent. So when we are talking about who is Asian, I think it is important that we do identify the many, many, many communities that exist from the continent of Asia. And again, you might not be first generation, you might be second gen or third gen. I think it's also about how you identify as well. Thank you.
Thank you, for sure. And another question we have for the Q&A is, what would you suggest students do if we feel we are experiencing racism?
Just very quickly, as Emily, everybody is saying, speak up. Seek help and reach out. Reach out to the educators, reach out to your fellow students, reach out to principals, reach out and I understand how difficult and how challenging it is, and we have to appreciate the strength and the resilience of the students, and also we have to support these the students who come forward. And really we have to have an environment, first of all, to say that racism would not be tolerated regardless, right? That statement, that principle, that policy has to come consistently across the TDSB. Secondly, is when it does happen, we need to have a mechanism in place and strategies in place so that people know where to turn to and where to get help. And support has to be in place so that we are not further traumatizing for trample on their rights to make it worse. So again, it has to be a system approach while supporting the individual to the best that we.
Yes, thank you.
I'd like to
Danielle,
add-
yes, for sure.
I'm sorry, Evan. I'd like to add that if someone is experiencing racism, you are not alone. It's really important to tell you, students, you are not alone. You can have a quiet conversation with another student, with a family member, with a teacher, with a social worker. You are not alone. And when you speak quietly with a friend, you two together can go and talk to an adult. And then, the adults, our job is to make space for you and to support you and to also share the responsibility. You're not alone to take on all the burden and responsibility to address racism. We're here to work with you to share responsibility so we can go hand in hand and make sure that things are done right.
Thank you, Danielle. Did you still want to say a small piece after this?
Yeah, just very quickly, I'm not an educator, but one of the things that we've done in my law firm is something that we call bystander intervention training, which is just a fancy way of saying, how can people around, if you notice something happening to a classmate, how can you engage, not even by directly confronting the situation, but by just saying, oh, I'm going to the cafeteria, did you want to come with me? Are there ways that you can sort of diffuse the situation, show that person that you notice, you've seen what's going on and you're there to support them? So that was the only thing I wanted to add, is that it's not only the responsibility of the person experiencing racism, but it's the shared responsibility of those who might notice to try to support in different ways.
Thank you, Danielle. That was an amazing and insightful discussion, and we are so grateful to have all of you here today. And thank you, Danielle, Emily, Salima, Amy, for sharing your insight and dedicating your time for our panel today. And for educators and students who joined us today, thank you as well. And we hope that this will spark some insightful change, conversations, and even projects at your school. We'd like to share some resources because the learning always continues at the TDSB. To acknowledge the continued resilience and barriers students face, a teacher-led resource was created. So this is for educators. And as we continue to support our system, you can check out this Addressing Anti-Asian Racism resource and the Asian Heritage Month guide, which is available with the TDSB. Could I see the next slide as well? And here are just a few examples of the multitude of resources that are available to you and your classroom. And I know that Salima also wanted to share the student learning strategy.
Yes, I just wanted to remind everyone that Director Russell Rollins has been working with a large team with a commitment to the student learning strategy, combating hate and racism. So we do have mechanisms in place at the TDSB, and as Emily shared, it is our collective responsibility. We are here to listen, and if one adult is not listening, find another, because we are all committed. So thank you.
Thank you, Salima. Before we end, I just want to thank Ali and all the organizers for putting this together. I have a list here of people we need to thank. The panelists, yes, the organizers, the Asian Heritage Month Volunteer Planning Committee, and Peter Chang, Shirley Chan, everyone who has been here, they're giving a wave. Ken Santos, Sophia Salim, of course, all putting this together for this month and for Asian Heritage Month. And we're so grateful to have them in our board. All right, and that concludes our session today. Have a wonderful day, everyone. The weather's beautiful outside. Have an amazing afternoon and happy Asian Heritage Month. Take care.